I never imagined that the worst betrayal of my life would come from the woman I had welcomed as a daughter. When I called Kate to ask what time my son's funeral would be, her cold voice cut through my grief like a knife. "He's long gone, Sue. And so are you." The line went dead, and with it, the last shred of my old life. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because the woman who answered that phone call wasn't the same Kate I had once loved, like my own flesh and blood. 3 years ago, I was living what I thought was a blessed life. My son Jake had just married Kate in a beautiful ceremony that I had spent months helping to plan. She was everything I could have wanted in a daughter-in-law kind: intelligent and absolutely devoted to my boy. When Jake was deployed overseas with his military unit, Kate and I grew even closer. She'd come over for dinner twice a week, and we'd spend hours talking about everything from her nursing job to our dreams for when Jake returned home. "You know, Sue," she said to me one evening as we sat on my porch sipping tea, "I've never had a mother figure like you. My own mom died when I was 12, and my stepmother, well, let's just say she made it clear I wasn't wanted." My heart broke for her that night. I squeezed her hand and told her, "You're not alone anymore, sweetheart. You're family now." How naive I was to think family meant anything to her. The first crack in our perfect picture appeared about 8 months into Jake's deployment. Kate started canceling our dinners, claiming she was working extra shifts at the hospital. When I'd call, she'd sound distant, distracted. I worried she was struggling with Jake being away. So I did what any concerned mother would do. I showed up with homemade soup and a listening ear. That's when I met him. Max. He was leaving her apartment just as I was arriving, and the guilty look that flashed across both their faces told me everything I needed to know. Kate stammered some excuse about him being a colleague from work, but I wasn't born yesterday. The way he touched her shoulder as he passed, the intimate familiarity in his goodbye, I knew my son was being betrayed. "Kate," I said once Max had driven away, "we need to talk." She invited me in, but the warmth that had always existed between us was gone. The apartment that had once felt like a second home to me now felt foreign, filled with an energy I didn't recognize. "I know what you're thinking," she said before I could speak, "but you're wrong. Max is just a friend. I would never—" "Don't lie to me," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I'd ever used with her before. "I can see it in your eyes. How could you do this to Jake? He's serving our country, trusting you to be here waiting for him." Her entire demeanor changed in that moment. The sweet, vulnerable girl I thought I knew vanished, replaced by someone cold and calculating. "You don't know anything about my life or my marriage," she snapped. "Daniel and I, we have problems you couldn't possibly understand. Then talk to him about them. Work through them. Don't sneak around behind his back." She laughed, actually laughed, and it was the most chilling sound I'd ever heard. "You think your precious son is perfect, don't you? You have no idea who he really is." I left that day with my world tilted on its axis. I spent sleepless nights debating whether to tell Jake what I'd seen. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that maybe Kate was telling the truth about Max being just a friend. But deep down, I knew better. 2 weeks later, I made the hardest decision of my life. I called Jake. "Mom?" His voice was tired. It was late there. Wherever there was, he couldn't tell me for security reasons. "Danny, sweetheart, I need to tell you something, and it's going to hurt." What followed was the most difficult conversation I'd ever had. I told him about Marcus, about the changes in Sarah, about my suspicions. Daniel went quiet for so long I thought we'd lost connection. "Danny, are you there?" "I'm here," he said finally, his voice hollow. I had a feeling something was wrong. Her letters have been different lately. Distant. "I'm so sorry, honey. I wish I didn't have to tell you this." No, Mom. You did the right thing. I need to know. That was the last time I spoke to my son. 3 days later, I got the call that would shatter my world completely. Mrs. Morrison? The voice was official, military. I'm calling to inform you that your son, Sergeant Daniel Morrison, was killed in action yesterday during a reconnaissance mission. The phone slipped from my hands. The room spun. This couldn't be real. I had just spoken to him. We had just talked about Sarah, about coming home, about fixing things. In my grief, I somehow convinced myself that Daniel's death was connected to our conversation. Had he been distracted? Had learning about Sarah's betrayal affected his focus during that mission? The guilt ate at me like acid. I called Sarah immediately, expecting to find her as devastated as I was. Instead, she answered the phone with an almost casual tone. "Oh, Margaret." "Yes," I heard. Terrible news. Heard? She heard? She was his wife. She should have been the first person notified. "Sarah, what? How are you holding up? We need to plan the funeral and—" "Actually, the military has protocols for this. Everything's being handled." Something in her voice made my blood run cold. There was no grief there, no pain. If anything, she sounded relieved. "I'm coming over," I said. "No, don't. I'm not up for visitors right now." But I went anyway. I needed to hold the girl who had loved my son, to grieve together, to plan how we'd honor Daniel's memory. When I arrived at Sarah's apartment, Marcus answered the door. The sight of him there, in my dead son's home, just days after Daniel's death, sent me into a rage I didn't know I was capable of. "Get out," I snarled. "Get out right now." "Mrs. Morrison, I think you should." ISAIDGETOUT. Sarah appeared behind him, and what I saw in her face will haunt me forever. Annoyance. Not grief, not shame, but pure annoyance that I was disrupting whatever sick celebration they were having. "Margaret, you need to calm down." "Calm down? My son is dead, and you have this man in your apartment." "Yes, Daniel is dead," she said with a coldness that stopped my heart. "And I'm moving on with my life. You should do the same." Moving on? It had been 3 days. 3 days since we lost Daniel, and she was already moving on? That's when the pieces started falling into place. The timing of Daniel's death, just days after I'd told him about the affair. The lack of grief from his own wife. The way she'd been so quick to push me away from any funeral planning. "You wanted him dead?" I whispered, the horrible truth dawning on me. "You wanted him to die over there so you wouldn't have to deal with a divorce, wouldn't have to face what you'd done." "Don't be ridiculous," Sarah said, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "You're glad he's gone. You're actually glad my son is dead." "I didn't want him to die," she said carefully, "but I'm not going to pretend to be the grieving widow when our marriage was over long before he left. It was over because you made it over, because you chose to betray him." Marcus stepped forward then, putting a protective arm around Sarah. "I think you should leave, Mrs. Morrison. You're clearly upset and not thinking straight. The sight of this stranger, this man who had helped destroy my son's marriage, telling me to leave, was the final straw." But instead of exploding, something cold and calculating settled over me. If Sarah wanted to play games, I'd show her what a real game looked like. I left without another word, but I didn't go home. I drove straight to the military liaison office and requested to speak with someone about Daniel's death and the arrangements for his body. What I discovered there made my blood boil. Sarah had already filed paperwork to have Daniel's body buried in a small, unmarked ceremony. No family notification, no military honors, nothing. She was trying to bury my son like he was nobody, like he had no family who loved him. But here's what Sarah didn't know about me. I might be a grieving mother, But I was also a woman who had worked in legal administration for 25 years. I knew how to navigate bureaucracy, and I knew my rights as next of kin. By the end of that day, I had lawyers involved. I had contacted Daniel's commanding officer personally. I had reached out to every military family support organization I could find. Sarah might have been his wife, but I was his mother, and I had rights too. The legal battle that followed was brutal. Sarah hired her own lawyer and tried to paint me as an unhinged, grieving mother who was harassing her. But I had evidence now. Photos I'd taken of Marcus at her apartment. Phone records showing she'd been in contact with him throughout Daniel's deployment. Witness statements from neighbors who had seen them together. More importantly, I had Daniel's letters. See, my son had been writing to me regularly throughout his deployment, but he'd also been writing letters he planned to give me when he came home. Letters about his marriage, his fears, his discoveries about Sarah's affair. Letters his commanding officer found in his personal effects and gave to me as his mother. In those letters, Daniel wrote about the phone call where I'd told him about Marcus. But he also wrote about something else, something that made my hands shake as I read it. I confronted Sarah about the affair during our last video call. One letter read. She didn't deny it. In fact, she seemed almost relieved that I knew. She said she'd been wanting to tell me for months, but didn't know how. When I told her we could work through it, that I still loved her, she went quiet. Then she said something that chilled me to the bone. Maybe it would be easier if you just didn't come home at all. I asked her what she meant, and she said she misspoke. But Mom, I don't think she did. Another letter, dated just 2 days before his death. I've been thinking about what Sarah said, and I'm worried she might try to make sure I don't survive this deployment. I know that sounds paranoid, but she has access to my deployment information through her security clearance at the hospital. She knows where I am and when. I'm being extra careful, but if something happens to me, I want you to know that it wasn't an accident. Reading those words felt like being struck by lightning. My son had suspected Sarah might try to have him killed, and then 3 days later, he was dead during what was supposed to be a routine mission. I took those letters straight to the military investigators and demanded they look into the circumstances of Daniel's death. What they found made national news. Sarah hadn't just been having an affair with Marcus. She'd been feeding information about Daniel's unit to enemy forces through Marcus, who wasn't just her lover, but was part of a network selling military intelligence. Daniel had died because Sarah had literally sold him out to the enemy. The phone call I'd made to tell him about the affair had prompted him to confront her, and when he started asking too many questions, she'd made sure he wouldn't be coming home to expose her. The trial was a media circus. Sarah tried to claim she was innocent, that Marcus had manipulated her, that she never meant for Daniel to get hurt. But the evidence was overwhelming. Text messages, financial records, testimony from other military spouses she'd tried to recruit it all painted a picture of a woman who had been systematically betraying military operations for months. When the guilty verdict came down treason, conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to the deaths of multiple service members, I felt no satisfaction. My son was still gone. The other families who had lost loved ones because of her betrayal were still grieving. Justice couldn't bring any of them back. But there was one more call I had to make. I waited until after Sarah's sentencing life in prison without the possibility of parole, and then I called the prison where she was being held. I used the same connections I'd built during the investigation to arrange a phone call. When Sarah's voice came through the line, she sounded different, defeated. The cold confidence was gone. "Margaret, why are you calling me?" "I wanted you to hear this from me personally," I said, my voice steady and calm. "Daniel is having the funeral he deserved. Full military honors. Hundreds of people who loved and respected him. His sacrifice is being recognized by a grateful nation." Silence. "And Sarah? You asked me once what time the funeral would be." Well, it's happening right now, as we speak. Daniel is finally at peace, surrounded by people who truly loved him. Meanwhile, you'll spend the rest of your life in a cage, knowing that everyone knows exactly what you are. I could hear her crying now, but I felt no pity. You were right about one thing, though, I continued. He is long gone. But so are you. You're dead to everyone who ever mattered, and you did it to yourself. I hung up and drove to Arlington National Cemetery, where my son was being laid to rest with the honor and dignity he'd earned. As I watched the flag being folded and placed in my hands, I thought about the woman who had tried to erase him, to bury him in shame and secrecy. She had underestimated a mother's love and a mother's fury, and now she would spend the rest of her life paying for that mistake. My son is gone, and nothing will ever fill that void in my heart. But he didn't die in vain, forgotten and dishonored. He died a hero, and the world knows it. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do to someone else. It's making sure the truth sees the light of day, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it.